Hello, I'm Judy Young, one of the co-authors of Angel Island, Immigrant Gateway to America.
And I'm Erica Lee, the other co-author of Angel Island.
I first learned about Angel Island in the 1970s when a park ranger by the name of Alexander Wise discovered Chinese calligraphy on the walls of the immigration station. I remember visiting that building and seeing these Chinese poems for the first time and being moved to tears. Why was it that I had never heard about this place? I later learned that my own father had been detained on Angel Island for 2 months when he immigrated in 1921. But the memories were so painful that he didn't want to talk about it. And yet I wanted to find out more about that history. So for the next 5 years, I worked with 2 other historians to collect and translate many of the Chinese poems that were left on the immigration walls, and also to interview former detainees who were willing to talk to us. And the result of all that work was this book, Island Poetry and History of Chinese Immigrants on Angel Island. More recently, new discoveries on and off-site of the island have made me realize the great diversity of immigration that was on Angel Island and the need to tell those stories as well. The opportunity came when the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation invited Erica and I to write a new comprehensive history about Angel Island in time for the 100th anniversary of the immigration station. I jumped at the chance.
My family also has an Angel Island connection. 2 of my grandparents entered the U.S. through Angel Island. But I don't think I really appreciated their journey to the United States until I became a historian, and I was researching the history of Chinese immigration during the exclusion era at the National Archives. I came across my grandparents' wedding photograph. It kind of just fell out of their immigration file. The wedding photograph had been confiscated from my grandparents and kept in that immigration file for 70 years. I spent a lot of time looking at lots of Chinese immigrant files, but as I sat in the National Archives looking through these dusty boxes, there were many times when I'd open up a file and find not a Chinese immigrant, but someone from Korea or Nicaragua or Afghanistan, Japan. I was intrigued by these stories, but I knew that I didn't have time to tell them just at the moment, so I put them aside and I hoped I could tell them another time. As Angel Island approached its centennial in 2010, I got that chance.
From 1910 to 1940, over 500,000 people passed through the Golden Gate, hoping to start a new life in America. But not all of them disembarked in San Francisco. Instead, most of them were ferried across the bay to the Angel Island Immigration Station, known as the Ellis Island of the West, for immigration inspection. For many, this would be the gateway to America. But for others, it was a prison and their final destination site before being sent back home.
We did a lot of new research in immigration case files, new oral histories. We worked with families and communities to find photographs and personal stories. We set out to tell these fascinating tales of Chinese paper sons, of Japanese and Korean picture brides, of South Asian nationalists, Filipino repatriates, Mexican families, and more. We wanted to find out who were these immigrants. Why did they come to the United States? What were their experiences on Angel Island? And what did they tell us about America?
Until recently, the Angel Island history has focused almost exclusively on the Chinese experience. And this has made sense in many ways. The Chinese made up the overwhelming majority, 70%, of the detainee population on Angel Island. And their average stay was 2 to 3 weeks, which was the longest among all the other immigrant groups. As many of the Chinese poems carved into the walls of the immigration barracks tell us, Angel Island was a place of anguish and pain for many Chinese immigrants. Let me read to you one of these poems. 夜靜微聞風蕭聲，形影相情見景永。雲霧散散也暗天，松聲唧唧月未明。悲苦相連天相顯，囚人獨坐倚窗邊。In the quiet of night, I heard faintly the whistling of wind. The forms and shadows saddened me. Upon seeing the landscape, I composed a poem. The floating clouds, the fog darkened the sky. The moon shines faintly as the insects chirp. Grief and bitterness entwined are heaven sent. The sad person sits alone by the window.
Take the case of Sotoshi. She arrived in San Francisco in July of 1924 with her 7-month-old son, Soon Din. While mother and son were detained at the immigration barracks, little Soon Din grew ill, and he actually died at the immigration station. Sotoshi was overcome with grief. She wanted to be with her husband. She wanted to be able to bury her son. Sotoshi, 3 weeks later, decided to commit suicide. She tried to commit suicide, and she hung herself in the bathroom of the women's barracks. The night matron found her and brought her to the immigration station hospital. She was saved, and through the efforts of the immigration lawyer, she was finally released from Angel Island. She went on to raise 8 children, and she lived to a ripe old age of 96. For her, Angel Island was both a place of despair, but also a place for new beginnings.
In contrast to the Chinese, the Japanese had an easier time at Angel Island because their country had strong diplomatic relations to the United States. Almost all of the Japanese immigrants were admitted into the country within a day or two, and they had the lowest deportation rate among all immigrant groups on Angel Island. But sometimes, U.S. citizens of Japanese descent like Gozo Yoneda would get stuck on Angel Island. Yoneda was a Kibe, born in the United States and educated in Japan. In 1926, he left Japan in order to avoid conscription into the Japanese army, and he came back to the United States. But when he arrived in San Francisco, his cousin was too busy with farm work to come to testify on his behalf. And as a result, Yoneda was detained at Angel Island for 2 months. While on Angel Island, he said he read Japanese newspapers and he wrote poetry into his diary. These poems were written in the waka style of 37 syllables. America is my country, so my birth certificate says, but America doesn't want me here. I hear sounds of different voices from the next cells: Chinese, Russian, Mexicans, Greek, and Italian. Voices of sorrow, nostalgia, rage, and passion. Well, finally, his cousin Okamura shows up at the island, and Yoneda went through a brief interview and was finally released. He would go on to become a very famous labor organizer by the name of Carl Yoneda.
South Asians had the highest rejection rates of all immigrants coming through Angel Island. One exception was the case of Vaishno Das Bagai, his wife Kala, and their 3 children, who arrived in Angel Island in 1915. Vaishno was from an upper-class family in Peshawar, which is present-day Pakistan. And when other immigration officials routinely rejected South Asians because they were, quote-unquote, likely to become public charges, Vaishno astounded them when he pulled out $25,000 in cash. They were readily admitted. Vaishno was committed to the United States. He was ready to start a new life. He was an Indian nationalist, and he wanted the British to leave India. He wanted his children to grow up in a free country. He adopted Western manners, he wore Western clothes, he bought a home, he started a business, he became a naturalized U.S. citizen. But 13 years after his arrival in the United States, Vaishno was bitterly disappointed in his adopted homeland. He witnessed fellow South Asian nationalists being arrested and deported from the country. He saw the South Asians were barred from owning land in many Western states. And a Supreme Court decision stripped naturalized South Asian Americans of their citizenship. In 1928, Vaishno was bitter and resentful. He decided to commit suicide by gas poisoning. He wrote a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle explaining his decision. I came to America thinking, dreaming, and hoping to make this land my home, and tried to give my children the best American education. But now they come and say to me, I am no longer an American citizen. Now what am I? What have I made of myself and my children? Obstacles this way, blockades that way, and bridges burnt behind.
We know that approximately 8,000 Russian and Jewish refugees journeyed across Siberia, Japan, and the Pacific to reach Angel Island. Among them was Alice Edelstein, who fled her homeland with her mother in order to escape Nazi persecution. It took them 2 years to get a visa with the help of friends in Milwaukee, so that by the time they were ready to leave, Italy had joined the war and the Mediterranean route had been closed to them. So instead, they had to take the Trans-Siberian Railroad all the way from Moscow to Vladivostok, 6,000 miles away, carrying only $6 in cash between them. Then from there, they boarded a ship in Kobe, Japan, with 100 other Jewish refugees from Vienna. When they arrived in San Francisco, most of the refugees were interviewed briefly and allowed to land. But Alice and her mother, because they didn't have any more money left to pay for the train tickets that would take them to Milwaukee, were taken over to Angel Island, where they were detained for 3 days until their friends could send them the money for the train tickets. During the journey, Alice lost 20 pounds, and she said that the staff at the Angel Island immigration station, seeing her condition, were very kind and wanted to fatten her up. So they served her oatmeal and milk every morning while she was there. And she said it was horrible stuff because she was lactose intolerant. Alice later married an engineer, had 3 children, and decided to come back and live in the San Francisco Bay Area. She said that Angel Island was the most beautiful place on earth to her. When she died at 86, she had her children sprinkle her ashes in the bay around Angel Island as she had requested.
Most immigrants coming to Angel Island came from across the Pacific, but we found that there were many who also came north from Latin America, countries like Guatemala, Mexico, Peru, Chile, Argentina. One of the stories that we found was that of Maria Lopez. She came as a Mexican refugee. She was living in Mexico with her husband and her young infant son. It was a time of extreme chaos and violence. She was visiting her husband in 1919 when political opponents discovered him and ambushed him. There was a struggle, and Maria was protecting her infant son while she witnessed her husband being shot and killed. She knew that it was no longer safe to stay in the country, so she fled later that day. She fled to the coast, and she took the first ship that was leaving the harbor. It just happened to be going to San Francisco and to Angel Island. By the time that they arrived in San Francisco, both Maria and her little son, Miguel, they were detained at the immigration station for 2 days, but then they were later admitted into the United States. Maria worked as a governess and as a domestic servant for many years. She later remarried Italian-American Joe Gargiulo, and they had 3 children. Together, they opened up San Rafael's first Mexican restaurant, one called Maria's Pueblo.
What do all these diverse stories tell us? While the numbers of immigrants passing through Angel Island pales in comparison to that of Ellis Island, it is still Angel Island with its greater racial diversity that allows us to best understand how U.S. immigration policies played out in daily practices at our nation's borders, forever changing the lives of immigrants and of America itself. In truth, Angel Island represents the best and the worst of American history. It's the story of America's welcome to the huddled masses yearning to be free, and its history of racial discrimination and immigration restriction.
We live in the midst of another great debate over immigration in America. There are those who insist that immigrants are bad for our economy and our society, while others remind us that immigrants remain important, an integral part of who we are as an American society. It is clear that immigration will remain a major issue in our nation's politics, in our local societies, in the halls of Congress, and in our courts. Remembering America's complex immigration history helps us recognize what is still great about the United States and what is left to be done for our country to fulfill its promise as a nation of immigrants.